Story 1. Wasn't the creator of Wonder Woman into bondage with his two lovers or something? She has her golden lasso to tie up foes, and in her earlier appearances, her weakness was that she would lose her powers if a man bound her hands. Story 2. You all remember when CeeLo Green wrote a song about drugging women and having sex with them, Necromancer, and then got in trouble for drugging women and having sex with them? Story 3. I vote for it being when Tarantino wrote a scene where Salma Hayek pours a drink down her leg and a guy drinks it as it runs off her toes, and then cast himself as that guy. Like, the scene even being included is already creator's fetish bleeding into the work. Never mind him putting himself as the guy doing the fetish thing in the scene. Story 4. This is more of a joke than a real answer, but I remember someone online joking about how Tim Burton has a thing for giving his girlfriends intensely dramatic death scenes. I don't think that's an inherently sinister thing, for the record, since Tim Burton and his girlfriends are all goth. Story 5. I remember reading an article where someone who worked on Shape of Water said Guillermo del Toro was adamant that the fishman's ass be perfect, so he would take pictures of the initial sculptures and send them to his family for opinions. He also insisted the fish lips be kissable. And you know what? I get it. Story 6. Ed Wood was arguably the worst Hollywood director to actually have a semi-successful career making low-budget films. His Angora fetish was so well known to people who knew of him at all, that when a 1994 biopic was made about him, it was subtitled Look Back in Angora. The biopic is actually quite good, directed by Tim Burton and starring Johnny Depp, and it won a couple of Academy Awards. Story 7. Went to the library today and grabbed a book about the paranormal. Within 2 pages, there were 3 stories about consensual and non-consensual intercourse with ghosts. Weird. So I kept reading, hoping the weird part was over, and then more came up. I gave up and went to look at cookbooks. Story 8. We don't talk about Mists of Avalon, since it turned out the writer of the book, with lots of child sex and weird incest stuff in it, turned out to be a pedophile who enabled other pedophiles. It's kind of hard not to see all the sexual content in the series, after revelations about Bradley, as basically just being fetish fantasy. Story 9. Remember in the first Michael Bay Transformers movie how he cast an inhumanly beautiful person in the lead female role, hypersexualized her with camera framing, and then named her Michaela Baines? I feel like, as a society, we didn't make a big enough deal about how weird that was. Story 10. Every female cast member of Star Trek. The next generation was either raped, impregnated in her sleep, or coerced into sex by a mind-controlling sex ghost. Not even joking. Story 11. Everything for Forgotten Realms that Ed Greenwood ever wrote. The man was an original 1960s polygamous sex hippie, and when you read his stuff on the realms, it truly shows. The "What does drow breast milk taste like" Twitter post is only the shallowest end of the pool. Note that I am in no way condemning him for any of this. The man knows what he likes, and the audience can deal with it or find a different setting. Story 12. William Moulton Marston, the creator of Wonder Woman, was very much into bondage and discipline in his relationships with women. That is why so many Wonder Woman stories had her being tied up, and originally, one of her weaknesses was that she would be rendered powerless if her hands were bound by a man. As an aside, he is also one of the inventors of the polygraph machine, and Wonder Woman's lasso of truth is a reflection of that. Story 13. I don't know if I'd call it a fetish, but I think it's hilarious how every movie Adam Sandler makes, his wife is unfathomably gorgeous every time while he's just like in basketball shorts and a bit overweight. Clearly projecting some of his own fantasy there. Story 14. Colin Dexter, the guy who wrote the Morse detective series. The main character, Morse, speaks poetically about girls in tennis outfits and school uniforms, and a disproportionate number of his stories involve older men having relationships with much younger women, often students. Story 15. From what I remember, Teen Titans Go was obsessed with twerking and butts. Then there was the one episode with the stomachs. And then there are the episodes where there is an obsession around Raven's legs. Story 16. Did not see it mentioned here, but in Louis C.K.'s show and stand-up specials, which mostly all came out before the allegations truly emerged about him being a serial masturbator in front of women, he included an undue amount of masturbation content and jokes in his material. I specifically remember a bit from the show where he is playing himself, having to defend masturbation on a TV show while debating the topic with a religious woman. I imagine that was him working out his demons and playing out worst-case scenarios should the worst ever be found out about him, which it eventually was. Story 17. The Adventure Time episode where Finn turns into a foot, and Jake keeps pressuring him to stay a foot. It ends with the line, "You'll understand when you're older." Surreal. Story 18. Going with something different here. Vince McMahon was the head of creative for World Wrestling Entertainment Wrestling for decades, and at certain times, he wrote himself into the show as a boss who made his female employees do things like strip for him to keep their jobs, get on all fours and bark like a dog, and kiss his bare cheeks. Now, he has major allegations against him from an ex-employee that make it seem like the real Vince McMahon is even more depraved, if anything. Story 19. I guess this might not rise to the level of a fetish per se, but I recall that Murakami, at least in the book titled 1Q84, and George R. Martin throughout the A Song of Ice and Fire books, have their female characters think about their own breasts to a bizarre and distracting degree. Story 20. The Wonder Woman creator, William Marston, who was heavily into sadomasochism and bondage, created Wonder Woman with her lasso of truth and all the scenarios that followed as a result. There is a lot more fetish projection with the whole Marston and Wonder Woman situation. He was an actual psychologist and had a romantic relationship involving 3 people with his wife and a younger woman who was used for much of the Wonder Woman modeling, among other things, but that is the most blatant aspect of it. Story 21. When I saw that Abercrombie and Fitch documentary, they were trying to emphasize the racist angle. However, they completely buried the lead with the story. The real story is that the brand's creator managed to turn his homoerotic teenage fantasies into a multi-million-dollar international empire. Story 22. Heinlein's brilliant, beautiful red-haired women who are utterly devoted to the male protagonist. You could assemble a basketball team from them, they show up so often. Story 23. The anime and manga series Made in Abyss is an amazing series, but a lot of the body horror feels really fetishistic, and to make things worse, the main characters are around 10 years old. Story 24. Steve Danuser was the lead writer for World of Warcraft, and he has a preference for blue-skinned women. Under his care, several female characters became blue or became noticeably more blue. He even inserted himself into the game as the right-hand man to Sylvanas, the Banshee Queen, who originally had gray or white-tinted skin as an undead, but now has noticeable ice blue skin. Story 25. Well, the big ones have already been said a dozen times, so I'll add the manga and anime fairy tale. It's mainstream, and clearly the artist has a collection of preferences he likes to display. It's not very subtle. Their other work is pretty tame, so no clue what the deal is. Story 26. I came here thinking I would see John Norman's gore books close to the top of the list. The guy wrote what was supposed to be a science fiction bestseller series, but consistently and systematically turned them into manifestos for his bondage, discipline, dominance, submission, and sadomasochism preferences. Story 27. Anybody ever see Jeepers Creepers 2? How about the early scenes where all the teenage boys sun themselves shirtless on the top of the bus, then go to the bathroom together shoulder to shoulder? Those sure were weird scenes. Story 28. My big conspiracy theory is that at least one writer on The Big Bang Theory had a piss kink. Seriously, watch the show for more than a few episodes and you'll start to see a pattern. Story 29. John Norman's series about the planet Gore. I read them as a teen and thought the first 5 or so were sort of lame copies of Edgar Rice Burroughs. Then I got to the book that was all about how great it was as a woman to be kidnapped and turned into a sex slave. That's where I gave up. I reread the first one recently, and while a bit dull, you can really tell that the author likes rebellious submissives. I'm not sure how many more I'll read. Maybe I'll get up to the same book with the sex slave propaganda to see if it was really that obvious. John Norman is still writing them. There are about 40 books in the series. I think they are self-published now. Story 30. Gene Roddenberry for Star Trek included a lot of unusual themes. There were subtle nods to themes that the networks wouldn't allow to be explicitly shown. Umox and the notable anatomy of Ferengi men, along with Ferengi women not being allowed to wear clothes, were some of these themes. He also wanted them to have large codpieces. Troy was originally supposed to have 3 breasts. The planet Risa simply existing. The episodes The Naked Time and The Naked Now And nobody can convince me that Beverly Crusher having a relationship with a ghost candle, a relationship her mother and grandmother also had, wasn't a Roddenberry fascination. The episode aired after he passed away. And that's just scratching the surface. Story 31, George R. Martin sure manages to squeeze a lot of inappropriate content into his works of fantasy. It's one of the things that just put me off his books for good, that, and how he slowed down the overall pace of the plot to an absolute crawl. Story 32, Piers Anthony, Xanth series, Incarnations of Immortality series, many other science fiction and fantasy books in series, includes a lot of nudity and large breasts in his books. Story 33, Ian Watson wrote the very first novels set in the Warhammer 40,000 universe back in the late 1980s. There's not a huge amount of feces-related content, but the fact that there's feces-related content present in every book is kind of suspicious. Story 34. Too many teenage girls and younger girls are being placed in very adult roles in Piers Anthony's work for me to think it's an exercise in art or perspective. Everyone's heard about Firefly if they've heard about inappropriate material out there. I haven't read that, but I did read the last Incarnation of Immortality book where Nox starts off at 12. Story 35. Anytime you got a close-up shot of someone being tickle-tortured in Looney Tunes? Feet fetish. That silly striptease bit with the psalm? Yes, that was from popular culture at the time, but you notice it was always animals doing it. If you watch old Looney Tunes with the sole purpose of seeing how many blatant fetishes pop up, you will ruin your childhood. Let's just put it at that. Story 36. Heinlein wrote a book where the main character goes back in time and has a relationship with his mother. I think in the same book he meets a couple of gender-swapped clones of himself and has relationships with them too. Story 37. Back in 2015, there was a major controversy about the Wikipedia administrator Neelix. He was a prolific contributor to Wikipedia and one of the top administrators. But eventually, it surfaced that he had created tens of thousands of redirects all about breasts. Examples include redirects for Booby Pump, Pump's Titties, and Titapumper, all to the Wikipedia page for Breast Pump, or redirects for Licks Titties, Sucking of the Boobies, and Licking of the Titty, all to the Wikipedia page for breastfeeding. A lot more can be read about this whole controversy. Story 38. I have always side-eyed George R. Martin because of Game of Thrones. But the two I know for sure are the creator of the 100 and how he would end a character based on their relationship when they left. And one character on the Vampire Diaries, if you don't know this one. Story 39. Stephen Moffat basically writes every female lead as a dominatrix. It's only an issue on something like Doctor Who, which is, for kids. No hate for River, Amy, or Clara, but you can absolutely tell it's his kink. Story 40. They say it's unsubstantiated, but James Matthew Barrie, who wrote Peter Pan, had a really concerning relationship with the kids he modeled his characters after in the book. Story 41. George R. Martin from Game of Thrones often describes young characters having children, and sometimes it's a bit much. For example, in the books, Helena, the wife of Aegon II, was 14 in the books when she had their twins. Viserys, the son of Rhaenyra, was 12 or 13 when his 19-year-old wife had their first child. Rhaella, Daenerys' mother, was also about 14 when she had Rhaegar. Aegon III, also a son of Rhaenyra, married Daenerys Velaryon when she was 6, described as the most beautiful 6-year-old. And Aemma Arryn, Rhaenyra's mother, was 11 when she married Viserys I. Story 42. Obligatory Quentin Tarantino foot fetish mention. Hell, in one movie he has Salma Hayek pour tequila down her leg over her foot into his mouth. Like, holy fuck. Story 43. David Lynch exclusively cast the most knockout gorgeous women in all of his work and wrote this scene. Story 44. In Final Fantasy XIV, particularly during the A Realm Reborn period, there were a lot of battles that involved enemies swallowing players. So much so that we started to question the interests of the developers. Story 45. Stephen King's years of heavy cocaine use included a lot of controversial content. I've heard the last 3 books of the Dark Tower series are great, but after Wizard and Glass being hundreds of pages of teenagers longing for each other and then being with each other, along with an old woman examining the girl to check her purity, I needed a break. And I never found my way back. Story 46. I'm surprised people haven't brought up long-running shows like Riverdale, where the creator literally wrote smutty Archie fan fiction, or American Horror Story, where Ryan Murphy cast the same-looking actor 100 times and put everyone in a gimp suit. Story 47. Richard Power's peculiar interest in urination in the overstory disrupted my immersion in the narrative so violently and without warning that I had trouble taking anything in the book seriously afterward. It almost felt like he had personally intruded on my thoughts. Story 48. Salman Rushdie's books often include a stunningly beautiful woman who cheats on her husband as a recurring character type. It's either a fetish or something he's working through. Story 49. Anything Ryan Murphy touches, it seems it's crazy. The amount of adaptations he's done, where an article will follow soon after pointing out all of the inconsistencies, or the real-life family will come out and say something was totally inaccurate.